Good morning and welcome to the Future Media Podcast. I'm Ricky Sutton.
And I'm Alan Chappell, and this podcast goes deep into the collision of big tech
and the future of the world.
We explore how companies like Google, Meta, and Apple are impacting each of our lives.
I'm an investigative journalist.
And I'm a privacy lawyer.
And every week, we speak with experts to bring the unreported details into the light.
Hello again, Alan. How are you, buddy?
I'm doing fantastic, Ricky. How was your week?
You're always so upbeat. My week, I've actually had I'm going to name drop here. I've been hanging out with the rich and famous because I've been down in Melbourne here in Australia for the opening of the Melbourne Grand Prix. I actually got to speak at the opening event, which was pretty cool. So I can tell you that they are all as rich and as pretty as they look on TV.
Well, I've spent much of my week watching college basketball and writing and opining on regulatory issues. I'm not sure which one I enjoy more. This time of year, it might be college basketball.
Is there a similarity between those two things? Yeah. What's the one thing that they've got in common?
Well,
other than you being there.
I'm a University of Connecticut basketball fan, and so I naturally think that the entire world, or at least the referees, are completely against us. And I feel that way as somebody who works with a lot of VC-funded companies. You feel like the world is against you sometimes. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, maybe it's just me being crazy, but that's the sentiment.
Well, I can tell you that I embarrassed myself down at the Melbourne Grand Prix. I'm coming down in the lift of my very swanky hotel. There's throngs and throngs and throngs of Formula One fans everywhere. About 2/3 of them are Ferrari fans. And I'm in the lift with Charles Leclerc, the Ferrari F1 driver. And I'm absolutely clueless that he's in the lift with me. I haven't even spotted him. And then the door of the lift's open and we just get mobbed. And I'm like, what's happened? This podcast must be really taking off here. And then I realized it had nothing to do with me. It was to do with this incredibly handsome guy next to me who happened to be a superstar. Anyway, that was my week. It's been very good. All right. So it sounds like we've both had a great week. I'm not entirely sure that Google's had a great week. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So look, unless you've been under a rock, I think everybody is probably aware that Google had an antitrust trial that was tackling its monopoly in search, which it lost. And then under the Biden administration, the Department of Justice said that it wanted to break Google up. And that some of those breakups, we'll talk about the things that they wanted to do today, but that breakup was pretty tough. And then when there was all change at the White House, there was a complete change of conversation in the industry that there's no way that the Trump administration would push through a breakup of Google that would damage, one of America's preeminent innovators, one of its most valuable companies. It would just never be allowed to happen, right? And then a week ago, the Trump DOJ comes out and says, yep, we're still going to break it up. And almost everything in that list is still going to happen. And so now, instead of it being a question of, well, will it happen? The question is how's it going to happen? And I think that's what we should be talking about today.
Yeah, I would agree. I think you have to squint a little bit to see the differences between what the Biden DOJ was proposing and what the Trump DOJ is now proposing in the final proposed remedies. So trial starts in just over a month, the remedies trial for the Google search case. And it's going to be fascinating to watch. What do we want to talk about first?
I think we should talk about what the actual remedies are. So you're a lawyer. Why don't you explain to people what a remedy is? Because a remedy is different to a punishment, right?
Well, yeah, I think it's similar enough. So a remedy here is, okay, so we've had a court say that Google is a monopolist. That's the decision came out and Google is a monopolist. So the remedy is, okay, what do we do about that? How do we roll back some of the anti-competitive behavior so as to restore the marketplace to its to something that's a little bit more competitive?
Yeah, which is the whole point of an antitrust trial. And so I wasn't much of an expert. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a journalist. And so I hadn't really needed to worry about antitrust forever until my industry became completely dominated by a monopoly. And then it's a crash course in learning what this actually means. And so my shorthand of what monopoly law is that you have to create a playing field where everybody can compete, because ultimately the consumer loses if innovation can't happen. And sometimes when a monopoly or a company is just so good at what it does, eventually it just sucks all the air out of the room and everyone else suffocates. And that's kind of how it's felt with Google, probably since about 2007. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the line of demarcation of things really started to go off the rails was when Google purchased DoubleClick. Now, there's a separate trial that's focusing on the ad tech stuff, but I still think that line in 2007, 2008, when the FTC and others had approved Google's purchase of DoubleClick, which at the time was by far the largest ad serving company, that really is when things started to go south.
Yeah, I think if you own all of the elements of the business, you basically own the web, and I think they're sitting at 91.47% share, Google, as of yesterday, looking at the data. So the interesting thing about the remedies is that, number one, we want to stop the market being dominated by one player. We want other people to have a chance. And the second thing is that you want to make sure that the company that has the monopoly can't create another monopoly. So you have to change something. And that's why it's a remedy, not a punishment. There's no point issuing a fine to somebody like Google because they've got so much money. It has to be that we have to change the way that business is done in the future, which is why it's a remedy. And so I find that very interesting. So the new DOJ, many of these are different people. They're certainly different leaders, under the Trump administration, says that it's going to break up Google. And so the things that it's really focused on is, and the one that gets the most headlines, is to force it to release Chrome, the search browser. Okay? So Chrome is 65% of all web browsing. Okay, so it's enormously dominant. I think it's got something like 4.2 billion users. All right. I mean, you and I, we're on the web all day long. We're sitting on Chrome. It might not be. You might not have gone to Chrome. You might actually be using an Apple device. But effectively, a lot of you're on their browser, but a lot of the data still flows through to Google. So across the board, a lot of what the internet has been created by Google. So one of the main request of the DOJ is to force the divestiture of Chrome. Yeah. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that they want to look at, and there's a change as well here. So originally, the DOJ had said that that Google couldn't invest in big AI companies, and any AI investments it already had, it had to unwind. Okay, that's actually changed, and I think we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah.
Then tell me about the stuff relating to the search indexing and the data, because that's kind of more in your ad tech world.
Yeah, and in my read, this is more of a clarification than a monumental change. But I think what they really tried to do is emphasize in this new proposed remedies that the data that Google obtains via its search index can't be used for its other endeavors. And I think what Google has done over the last several years is just sort of assume that data collected pursuant to its search activities, which most publishers had supported over the years, because in return for that, Google would hand them traffic. That was sort of the deal. Well, Google just sort of assumed that, the data that we're collecting pursuant to our search index, we're going to use it for other things, including the training of LLMs as part of Google overlays, and there are a couple of other uses. So what the DOJ is saying is, no. You have to offer, Google, website owners, publishers, the ability to opt out on a use case by use case basis for all of the different ways that you might want to use the data. So in theory, a publisher could say, all right, I'm okay with the search index, but I'm not okay for the overlays the use of it for AI. So it's sort of a Chinese manual, if you will. Now, it's an interesting way of looking at things and sort of aligned with basic privacy concepts. Like, without going into the entirety of privacy law, I will just say this. In general, if you collect data for A and you use it for B, that is called a secondary use of data, and generally speaking, that is frowned upon. In some contexts, you can't do that without getting user consent. Now, here, you only need arguably user consent, but you would need the consent of each publisher, because then there's a whole intellectual property consideration there. So to say that Google was being a little cheeky in terms of collecting data for purpose A and then using it for B, C, D, and E, that might be an understatement.
Yeah, and the rest of the alphabet. So I think that maybe that's why it's called alphabet. This is why. So I've spent quite a lot of the last couple of weeks talking to very senior media executives around the world around the implications of this, and I've been really surprised by the response. I just want to kind of put it on the record, just so the industry understands, especially if you work in this industry. A lot of people, even at the very, very top, are still skeptical that this is going to take place. They're too fearful to hope for a better outcome. And I think that after 25 years of kind of losing ground a little bit every single day, they've forgotten how to win a bit, which is a bit disappointing. And what I'm a little bit nervous about is whether or not the industry is going to suddenly realize that the future is coming to its aid, and they're going to be too slow to get there. So there's work to be done. There's been failures on the publishing side as much as there's been monopolization on the Google side. So I think you have to be fair about this. But where we are is at a transition point. AI has effectively caused a transition point where we can start to build a better future. And that means better search engines, means better discovery, means better monetization. It means a rethink on privacy. It means a rethink on how advertising works. Maybe a rethink on targeting. And so this really feels to me like day one of a new era. I was specifically asked on stage, it was the first question I got on stage the other day, was, Ricky, how big of a deal is this? Is this like digital, is it like going from digital to mobile, or is it from going to print to digital? What is it? And I said, I think it's probably going from print to digital. I think it's that. And the bloke in the audience just shouts out, he goes, no, this is the Gutenberg printing press moment. And so clearly people are starting to think really deeply about just how big a transition point this is. And I wonder how many years it will be before we all think that Alphabet and Google is kind of the AOL of its era.
I think history would suggest that at some point that is a fait accompli. Now, the question that becomes, is that 3 to 5 years from now, or is that 10 to 15 years from now? Because Google is trying to undergo a pretty significant pivot. But to get back to your earlier comment, because I think it's a really astute one, Ricky, is it's okay to have some skepticism that antitrust law is going to result in the thing you're hoping it's going to result in. But that should never be an excuse for inaction or for hiding your head in the sand. And that's what I feel like a fair amount of, I would say the publishing community, but even the advertising community has been doing over the last couple of years. Look, the deck is stacked against us. There's 50 years of precedent that suggests that the U.S. government, at least, is just not going to do a whole heck of a lot. There's a couple of isolated examples of where they started down that path. A lot of times it didn't reach some level of fruition. So I get the skepticism, but what I can't accept is the inaction. You need to have a strategy here.
Yeah, let me put you on the spot on that, actually, because this is something that I'm going to handle the publishing industry, okay? So I'm in their ear all the time, so I'll take that one on, okay? But on the advertising side, this is another part of the ecosystem that's been kind of coerced and co-opted into the Google model over the past 10, 15 years. And publishers have become increasingly frustrated with the advertising market that they won't support them. And their response is, well, you're too old and curmudgeonly, and it's just easier for us to buy our ads on Google and buy it on Meta. But if the two industries, the publishing industry and the advertising industry, can co-align, then there's an opportunity here, okay, to rebuild what we had before, which might be better for our two industries than it has been in the past. Why do you think there is still pushback, or not pushback, that's the wrong word. Why do you think there's reticence or a fear to move into this future in the ad business? Is it just too easy at the moment?
Well, I think you have to bifurcate the discussion a bit. So I'm going to start with advertisers. I don't think advertisers feel like they have a horse in this race for whatever reason. And some of that is this. Coke does not really care what the rule set is, what the accuracy of campaigns are, the effectiveness of campaigns are, as long as two things remain true. As long as Coke is at some level of parity in terms of their ability to advertise with Pepsi, neither of them really care. That's number one. And number two, as long as there are limited number of times where they end up on the cover of the Wall Street Journal for being next to something bad or for getting accused of doing something bad, so the CMO has to crawl into the CEO's office. If you minimize number two and keep that level of parity with number one, I think you're just not going to see the advertisers feel like they have a horse in this race. It's sad, but I think that's the truth.
That has to be the lowest bar for a $1 trillion industry in human history, doesn't it? I mean, I just want it to... I know it's wrong, and I know it's a lie, and I know it's a monopoly, but you know what? It's good enough for me. Let's do it again tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, well, I'll tell you what. Explain to me the alternative theory for why the entities who are holding all of the money have almost no influence regarding how all this stuff works out.
I totally agree. And worse than that when you create a situation that's so foggy and so grey, everybody that wants to obfuscate and sees an opportunity to take a tiny clip of the ticket as stuff goes through, everybody tries to fix a little bit of it for a tiny clip. And what you end up with is kind of a Borg mothership of chaos for that's a Star Trek reference, everybody. You end up with just a total mess of matchsticks glued together that you're trying to turn into a ship in stormy seas. It just feels doomed to failure. And so I'm really hoping that when this antitrust breakup happens, we can kind of draw a line under what was kind of our first go at the internet and the first go at monetization, and just draw a line under it and go, that was really good. I mean, it was a pretty exciting, thrilling ride for 25 years, but it led us directly down this path that ultimately ended in a dead end. What we now have the opportunity to do is to think about it again and go, okay, well, what are we going to build that's more sustainable, that's more fair, that enables more people to play and enables innovation to happen? I'd love to think that was what was in the DOJ's mind when they gave this a go.
Well, it could be. I mean, I would like to think that. By the way, I should mention, it's not just the advertisers who have an issue. It's the agency holding companies who have their own consolidation and competitive issue, where there's just not a huge incentive to innovate. You find some new hip ad agency every once in a while, and they get bought by, one of the holding companies, and then, from my perspective, you rarely ever hear from them again. Or now they've been buying over the last 10 years data companies. They bought Axiom, they bought a couple of other, Epsilon was bought by Publicis. So they really aren't competing with anyone. I mean, if they're competing with each other to an extent. But even there, the incentives for innovation and for driving advertiser value are just not what they need to be.
100%. And so I get a little bit triggered when we head down this path, because when I was running media companies, I would have the most astonishing demands put on me by holding groups for what I had to do to get access to a share of their ad spend. Now, I had, in many cases, 40 to 50% market share in my space. I knew who my audience were. I had very, very rich first-party data. I knew what their behaviors and their preferences were. I had a brand that they trusted. They visited my news site 15 times a day. They spent an average of 1.5 to 2 minutes on my pages every single day. When something really important happened, they came in their tens of millions to my site every day. And when really important stuff like COVID happened or something scary happened, it was always to us that they came. And it's interesting. I was having a chat with the boss of the BBC a little while ago, and she said to me, look, the BBC's the BBC when terrible things happen, because the BBC lights up. It's where the world comes. It's the place that we know we can be trusted. And so I'd have the agency people come in and they'd sit down and they say, well, Ricky, look, we can't give you the money, or we can't give your paper the money because you don't have the data. And I'd say, yes, but what data? Because the data you're telling me that Google's got, you accept that data's not true. You know it's not true. So you want me to have untrue data as well when I've actually got true data? And they just said, no, we just want you to have more data. I mean, this whole thing was a circular, it was just a nightmare. You couldn't ever get out the other side. And we knew that we could deliver for advertisers great results. But the agencies were locked into this kind of group hallucination that it was just better to just keep throwing the money at Google. It was almost like you don't get fired for using Google, but you might get fired for trying to be clever. And that felt like an end of innovation.
Well, it's funny. I just wrote a piece this week on, what in the world happened to measurement, because increasingly there are more and more walled garden type ad platforms where you can't rate the efficacy of your media spend, and you can't engage in anything resembling measurement, and you have no idea how the darn thing works. And so, and the new canard is, well, we're using privacy enhancing technologies. I'm like, great, brilliant. How does it work? Oh, well, we can't really tell you that. And it's like, and you wonder how many people on the teams who are building the darn thing really even understand how it works. See, it doesn't matter, because from the advertiser standpoint, as long as they are reasonably confident that they got the same deal, Coke got the same deal as Pepsi, all is good in the world.
You see, that's going to be chapter 6 in the history book on this. Is going to be that none of this had anything to do with creating a better internet or a better experience for consumers. It had everything to do with taking a 20% margin. Yeah. And I think that that's why Internet 1.0 is ending, because it's led itself down a path where all the money goes to 5 companies and the internet's getting worse, not better. That has to be the moment when you just go, antitrust is now essential. Stop the bus. I want to get off. And then let's go and do something else. So let's talk about that, because I think you saw it, Alan. I caused a bit of a stir on LinkedIn this week when I provocatively posted that I thought that when Google is forced to divest of Chrome, it should be given to the news industry. And there were quite a lot of very quick knee-jerk reactions from people. Things like, they'd never be able to manage it. They don't have enough money. I heard that one a lot. They don't have enough money. There's absolutely no chance that they'll be able to make search work. Chrome can't work without Google. Now, they can't respond to me here, but I'm just going to tell you what I think. None of those things are true, by the way. None of them. So the first thing is that the news industry together, collectively, even if Chrome costs $20 billion, you only need the top 4 media companies to collaborate to be able to buy it. So that the industry can't afford it is not true. Okay, so that's the first thing. I mean, Reuters alone has a market cap of $74 billion. So the news industry isn't all a load of men in Macs scratching around in the dirt. Okay, some of these media companies are still big and powerful. So that's the first thing. It can be done. The second thing is that they don't have to learn to code. If part of this divestiture is that Chrome now leaves Google, then it will go with all the people with it in the same way as it would be with almost any acquisition. And so there'll still be expertise, and there are lots of ways to slice and dice this. But what I see as the opportunity, the reason I made that outlandish thought or outlandish suggestion, was because the web is losing its trust and the pact that exists between consumers and the web and advertising and publishing has broken down, not, I think, because of advertising and not because of publishing, okay, but because of this monopoly. And now there's an opportunity to try and put those pieces back together, and we need it more now than ever. Do you think I'm completely mad? Have I totally lost my marbles here?
No, I don't think you have. I think that the first thing that's really important to emphasize here is there really isn't an ideal landing place for Chrome. There just isn't a perfect one. And so, if we've ruled out it can't stay with Google, it seems to be, and then you kind of have to rule out that it shouldn't go to Meta or
yes.
Amazon or Apple. So you've ruled out most of the companies that could probably afford the darn thing. Publishers are sort of an interesting dark horse here, and I say dark horse because normal people who aren't really thinking about this stuff, that might not be the first group of companies that they think about. But I think that can work. I think there's going to be challenges around unwinding how Chrome is integrated into the rest of Google. Certainly formidable challenges there. Although, they did manage to, back in the olden days, pre-technology, they did manage to unwind a whole bunch of phone companies from each other. And that probably wasn't easy either.
Yeah. So my thinking is that, and this is because I've been a startup founder as well as a media executive, is that sometimes you just need to stop and imagine what the best future is and not worry about how to get there. Just for a moment, have a look for the North Star and just go, well, that's what the world will have to be. And when you free yourself to think like that and have that mindset, you eventually figure out that that's exactly how the future works, because the way humanity always works through evolution is you always get to a better place. And so you just have to accept that if the present you have is no good and the future you want is this, then the answer is yes, and take the first step to try and get to that new future. And so for me, I think that the internet that I signed up for said, I can go here, I can search for anything, I can find anything, it's deeply convenient, I can 100% trust it, I accept that some of it will be free, and I accept that some of it will be paid, but I do want it to be right, okay? And I do want it to be fair, and I do want it to support us in the entire ecosystem. And that just isn't happening right now. So part one of re-enabling some of those things for me, and I'm speaking for my industry here, is that if the web is now filled with content that is trusted, and a press release went out and said 36,000 of the world's publishers have all decided to co-align to work on building a better internet that's entirely trustworthy, with a 100% trustworthy search engine, with content that's all been curated by the world's best editors, and we're going to use that to create the world's first AI recommendation engine that's 100% grounded on trusted content and not the open web and not Reddit, then I think that has value, and that's a start for the future. And I actually think that the straw man for that is Chrome.
Yeah, I like that idea. I think that there's certainly something to that. The challenge might be that we'd have to figure out how they're going to ultimately pay for it, and if they're going to pay for it, they're going to need to do that probably via advertising, and we could talk a little bit about that. It's not an insurmountable challenge, but it's a consideration. And then there's sort of the idea of who's going to run this, because one thing that doesn't get talked about in the publisher world. You said 26,000 publishers all hand in hand. My sense, as somebody who isn't a publisher but kind of watches this stuff, is that there's stratification there, and that the large publishers really could barely give two shits about the smaller and the mid-sized publishers, and then news publishers are sort of their own thing, and then you got Jason Kint and the Digital Content Next, who sort of has their own their own set of goals and ambitions. So that to me might be the biggest challenge here: is how do you get all of those cats to play together? And I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. So that you used exactly the right word. And again, this will be chapter 9 of the history book, because it's going to talk about cats. Okay. So I know the internet's about cats. This is a slightly different version of cats. So every time I talk to the most senior media executives at the absolute top, in the top 5 or 6 people in the world that either own or run these media companies, they say to me, well, Ricky, that involves herding cats. And I hear that a lot. Now, I'm a cat person, okay? And if we don't figure out how to herd the cats are going to go extinct. And I think that eventually you just have to figure out that the decision between definitely dying and the alternative being trying something really hard, the answer has to be try something really hard. Yeah, if you're in a desert and you're dying because you're stuck in the desert, it's really exhausting to walk out of the desert, but that's pretty much your only option. And so I think for the news industry, I'm hoping that there's action going on behind the scenes. I don't know if there is. I know I'm doing some lobbying, but I don't know what they're doing. To just say to the DOJ and say to the US government, really, you and Google and the public need a soft landing from this change. And the safest soft landing, the biggest cushion for this, is probably to hand it over to a plurality of media companies and say to them, you do it. Now, it won't be perfect. There'll be mistakes. Things will go wrong. There'll be headlines because the media can't help but stare at its navel. That it won't go completely smoothly, but it won't go completely smoothly if you give it to Oracle either. It won't go completely smoothly if you give it to Meta, because you just create a new monopoly there. So someone has to be given it. And I just think that after 25 years of struggling, this is the opportunity for the media industry to pull its big boy pants on and do its job, and lead after 25 years of not leading. And you can spend every hour of every day moaning about how hard your life's been for the last 25 years. But if you don't have the courage to step up when the opportunity is there, all of that moaning was for naught.
Just to build on your desert analogy, transcendental meditation whilst in the middle of the desert will probably make the experience of dying a little bit more pleasant.
Is that right?
But it's not a strategy for living.
No, I literally said exactly that on stage. I said to the media bosses the other day, I said, let me just tell you that extinction is not a good business model. Yeah. So if that's the case, you probably need a plan B. Yeah. And I think here, actually, it's plan C. I think the C is Chrome. I just think the media industry should give it a go. Put your name in the ring, right? I don't know exactly how it will play out, but show some courage to step in.
At some point, you've got to tell me how that type of sentiment goes over, because the image that's coming to my mind is Ricky Gervais at the Oscars. But I don't know.
That's that. Now you mention it, that it is a bit like that. But sorry to keep going on with the analogies, but these are very accurate. If you're a football team that's lost every single Sunday for 25 years in a row, yeah, and you're the striker of that football team, or even if you're the coach of that football team, it's very, very difficult to get yourself up on a Saturday morning, walk onto the pitch and go, we're going to win this. So I fully appreciate that going from minus 10 Ks an hour to 1,000 Ks an hour is a huge transition. But the alternative is not to, which is a full stop.
Yeah.
Okay. So either the media industry steps into the breach and takes a courageous move like this. And by the way, there will be one of these courageous opportunities along once every 25 years. So my strong recommendation is to take it. The second one is that if they don't, I think we see a dying off of a very large amount of the media, and we see the rise probably of masses of media, niches of media. And so, you've got a newsletter, I've got a newsletter. We're part of that new future, having had a footprint in that past. So we're probably well qualified to be able to know how to navigate the old and the new. But if we don't create it, or we don't step in, if the publishing industry doesn't step in, I don't know who's going to get Chrome. And if it goes to somebody like Mozilla, then we should talk about that. I'm not sure that's the best outcome. If it becomes a spin-off of Google but is still controlled by Google, I'm not sure that's a great outcome either. If it goes to the government, then that's going to lead to a breakdown of the World Wide Web, and we're going to end up with a splinter net of different, national interest internet. There is no really good outcome here, alternative here that I can see.
Yeah, I am not excited about the Truth browser.
Oh, yeah. That'd be good. It's a good name. Look, so let's talk about Mozilla for a minute. So one of the people that have, one of the groups that has put their hand up to say, hey, we'll take over Chrome, we'll give it a go, has been Mozilla, right? Do you want to talk through that a bit?
Well, so Mozilla is making what I think. So they issued a blog post and are starting to go around and socialize this idea that that prohibiting Google from working with other browsers and paying them for search queries, that's anti-competitive. And actually, I am quite sympathetic to that argument. Like it's not a good thing if the only way to monetize a browser is to have a very large company own it and subsidize it. That's not a great outcome. It's not a great outcome for users. It's not a great outcome for marketplace competition. It's certainly not a good outcome for an ad-supported digital media marketplace. One of the issues I have with Mozilla, and this is sort of a historical issue, at least going back to a dozen years, is that they're making disingenuous arguments because you can't continue to hold yourself out as privacy first and then say, yes, we really want the government to allow us to continue to sell our user data to Google. And those are the two arguments that they're making right next to each other. And it's kind of odd because those two statements are completely opposite of each other.
Yeah,
antithetical.
They 100% are, and I have to jump in here, and I'm going to talk about Apple a little bit. So, every marketing campaign for Apple for the last 8-9 years has been look at our privacy. It's the differentiator between us and those other filthy companies that take all your data. People like awful Google and I couldn't imagine. And then when you have an antitrust trial, what I love about the antitrust trial, it's like pulling a Band-Aid off. And suddenly you see that there's this huge deal that was done in the back rooms that no one really knew much about between Google and Apple, so that whenever you use the Safari browser on any Apple device, iPhone or otherwise, and you do a query in it, you get a search result back, but that search result comes back from Google. And the data from that user goes to Google. So the great privacy phone was actually sending half of the world's mobile traffic and data off to Google. And so it's the same as the Mozilla thing, right? Everything is built. If you dig down a couple of sediments down into the sand, you eventually find it's Google bedrock underneath everything. And that's another part of this whole monopoly argument, right?
Well, also, this has sort of been forgotten by history a little bit, but there was a brief time where Mozilla went away from Google and they started working with Yahoo and allowing Yahoo to monetize their search results. And the big reason they did that is that Yahoo had their own about face, which I sort of came after them about. But Yahoo changed their minds about a do not track setting and decided that, okay, we're going to support that setting. So Mozilla said, yes, we want to work with Yahoo because Yahoo is more privacy safe than Google. Okay, fair enough. Except after a year, 2 years, I forget the time period, but they decided, wait a minute, we aren't really able to make nearly as much money working with Yahoo. And so then they quietly switched back to Google. So the challenge I have is that you sort of lost the high road on privacy if that's been your practices over the last decade.
100%. So I'll put you on the spot here. So you're a privacy lawyer, okay, and so this is really your specialty, not mine. We've got all of the world's information, all of the data, the fingerprint on humanity is held by Google. Yeah. And a lot of that comes from Chrome. I can only imagine that Chrome has been a massive contributor to filling in any gaps that Google might have had about who everybody is and what everybody does and what they look at and what their preferences are. In a post-Chrome or post-Google Chrome future, how is that data privacy going to be managed? Is this also an opportunity to reset the clock on privacy? And what do you think that future state should look like?
Well, for one thing, I think that so my first thinking about any privacy law is that it really needs to focus more on the scale and the size and the sensitivity of the data collected, because we have a remarkably one-size-fits-all regime almost everywhere in the world. There is a very limited exception within U.S. law for telcos, and that exception is that anything the telco touches, anything that goes through their pipes, is subject to an enhanced opt-in consent standard that. Ironically, if you kind of look at what a telco gets and you look at what Apple gets and Google gets and Meta gets, the scale is similar. If anything, I think the edge providers, as they used to be called, have exceeded the telcos. We need a set of standards that recognizes that there's certain data sets that you need to be really worried about. There's certain data sets that maybe you don't need to be worried about. And if you really focus the regulatory rule set on the size and the scale and the sensitivity of the data, I think you have an opportunity to enable things like ad-supported stuff, as long as it stays outside of the identifiable world. You adapt some privacy-enhancing technologies so that you increase noise, making it much, much more difficult, if not impossible, to re-identify people. That's a very different world than the one we are right now.
But if you did what I described just now and drew your North Star for what the Shangri-La looks like, that we end up in a situation where the industry can be funded, the web can be funded, advertising can exist. People are always going to want to sell washing machines, right? And people are always going to want to buy washing machines. And so we have to build an infrastructure that enables all of that ecosystem to coexist. So if you had control, you're in charge of the FTC tomorrow, what would you do?
Can I just say break up big tech? I mean, that sounds, I think that has to be almost the starting point, because that gets me to the smaller data sets. That gets me to a certain amount of innovation. That gets me to a world in which, the small niche advertiser is able to compete with the Procter & Gamble and the Unilevers of the world. Because right now, it's really difficult. And the only thing holding some of the niche advertisers together is the fact that Meta, at least historically, has been able to offer them an opportunity to find their niche users. So I think that that one of the things that probably doesn't get discussed enough is that there needs to be a balance here, because I from my perspective, there is value in some level of personalization. There is value in enabling some types of advertisers who are niche, who are going to end up with very small but interesting and powerful businesses to a certain constituency. That type of model needs to be supported. Now, should that model be supported to the extent to the exclusion of everything else, and so that privacy completely goes out the window? No. Absolutely not. And I think that also tends to get lost in some of the discussions I have in, candidly, the ad tech privacy world.
So do we actually get to the future by going backwards? Is that what we're saying? That we reduce the level of targeting, we reduce the level of surveillance, that gives us a better outcome? Because I have an opinion on this, but do we really have to go back to find a new way forward?
I do. I actually think that's a sort of an intriguing way of looking at it. And I would agree with that. But that only works if there is some way to independently rate the efficacy of your media spend. There's only works if there's a way to do measurement. It only works if there's some real way to for an advertiser to trust where their impressions are landing, what is actually happening, where the true attribution sources are. And the problem right now, and a lot of this is big tech, and some of it is certainly the opaqueness of how the ad tech world has worked. None of that is possible, and so we're still in this, what's the snake oil sales? Better targeting. At some point, that stuff becomes irrelevant, because on the back end, you can't measure, and on the back end, you have no trust in attribution, and on the back end, you don't even know exactly where your ads are going. So all the targeting in the world is almost irrelevant, absent some level of clarity on the back end.
Yeah, so that's really become a science of diminishing return, hasn't it? I'm going to be more targeted. I'm running ever closer to the law of privacy. But as you said and pointed out, and I think a lot of people forget this, is that almost all of the performance of all of this is measured by Google, which is also the largest player in the space. And you have to believe their numbers, and you don't know if they're true or not because there's virtually no opacity or transparency to any of the things they do. So if you're selling a washing machine, you've no idea. If you're a holding group, you've got no idea. If you're the ad buyer pressing the button, you don't get fired for saying Google. You then get the report back. It comes back to you from Google. You then give it to the people selling washing machines and say, Google gave us this, and the whole thing goes again. It is literally a spin cycle around washing machines.
Well, and it's not just Google. So just this week, Microsoft announced on their Edge browser some new privacy-enhancing technique that would enable their API to enhance privacy, and they were talking about it on LinkedIn, and I replied with one comment, which is, "This sounds cool. Let me know how this helps me rate the efficacy of the media spend." And absolute crickets. Nobody wants to talk about that.
Yeah, funny that.
I'm not here to beat up Microsoft. I mean, I just think, but I do think that we need to call things what they are. And if you're going to have a privacy enhancing technology in place that only continues to obfuscate my ability as an advertiser to see what it is that's going on underneath the hood, then please, you're not helping anybody.
Yeah, and in the last sentence, underline, and you can trust us. Because that's the way it ends. So you don't need to beat up on Microsoft because the FTC and the US government is beating up on Microsoft. So just this week, as the FTC doubled down on its determination to bring antitrust action against Microsoft. It's focused on its investments in OpenAI and how those were done. So we've pretty much got a pile on at the moment. So we've had the two Google antitrust trials, and we've got the third one, which we'll get a result on fairly soon, which is focused on ad tech. We've got a Meta antitrust trial that starts on the 14th of April. Got it on the wall over here. There's so many of them now. And then you've got, there's an Amazon one next year. There's an Apple one next year. All of the big tech companies, all of them, are finally facing, some reckoning after 25 years of a free run, which is a big deal. Now, I've got an idea for you. Now, you triggered an idea in my head. We were talking earlier on about herding the cats.
Yeah.
Yeah. You and I should launch a new business, and we should call it Cats Squared. And the reason we should call it Cats Squared is because I'll organize and corral the cats in the publishing industry. But to your point, the only way that we can go forward together is with a single understanding of rules and measurement, a rule around privacy, a consistent rule around copyright, a consistent rule around who owns what, a consistent rule around CPM and sell-through and measurement and efficacy. So I'll tell you what, I'll roll up the publishers, you roll up all the advertisers, and we'll put them all into the new Chrome browser, and we'll call it Cat Squared. What do you reckon?
I love it. We'll have to pay. I am sure that there is some tiny agency in Brooklyn named Cat Squared already, so we're going to have to pay somebody for the name. But other than that, I love the idea.
As far as I can tell, the Chrome browser represents 65% of all the web's traffic, and Google makes all its money from advertising, and it made $350 billion in revenue last year. And according to the antitrust trial, the Google Chrome browser has an operating cost of $4 billion a year. So if I can spend $4 billion for $212 billion of revenue, I can afford to buy Cat Squared from your company down the road by the chip shop.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And so let's get to kind of where all this ends up. Is that I think a couple of motherhood statements are true. Number one, the future isn't going to be like the past.
Yes.
And the Google that we've had is not going to be the Google that we're going to have in the future. And the way that people discover content on the web is going to change, whether that's driven by Chrome or driven by Google search changing, or driven by the rise of AI search, probably a combination of both. But the way we discover content is not going to be the same. The way we distribute content is not going to be the same, because words and pictures probably isn't going to be the predominant way that content is distributed in an AI future of speech and audio and visual. So that's going to pivot. So we've got a change in discovery. We've got a change in distribution. We're also going to have a change in monetization. So the three legs of the stool that have driven the internet for the past 25 years are all being carved off, and now we have to create a whole new chair that we're comfortable with, right?
Yeah.
That's what's ahead of us, and I wish that would sink in with people, because as I said, too many people are sitting there and just going, this will never happen. This Google will never be broken up by the US government. It's happening, folks. And that the internet isn't a thing we go to. It's the entire infrastructure of human information sharing and monetization. And everybody uses it. Everybody needs to be focused on this. It baffles me that this isn't the topic of conversation in every pub.
Yeah, and even within the greater ad tech world, where I'm talking to people every day, it's very few who are really talking about this kinds of stuff. They're talking about the new industry term. They're talking about what a particular founder is up to. They're talking about the latest slight, or some article that promoted them over somebody else, or but it's a very quarter to quarter type of a thinking, and for better or worse, that's the exact non-strategic way of thinking that's led the industry into the place that it's in now.
Yeah, if you've been losing for this long, strategy becomes an afterthought, doesn't it? I'll give you an example on that exact topic. So extend that analogy. I talked about 3 legs on the stool. There's 4 legs on a deck chair on the Titanic as well, right? And that's the whole point. If you want to be part of the future, you have to get off the past. Yep. Yeah. And so I think that for us, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a lot over the weeks and months ahead in this podcast, is that we need to set a searing vision for what the future looks like. We need to decide what we want it to be. And then some of us have to have the courage to step up and say we're going to do it ourselves if no one else is going to do it. Maybe cat squared's a thing. Maybe we should just quickly pop down to Delaware and incorporate that.
We should. We'll get that. We'll get the URL. We'll do it .ai. Isn't that what everybody's doing now?
Sounds like a great plan. What, have we missed anything? Was there anything you wanted to add?
No, the only other thing, since we've been talking a lot about Google, it's probably worth mentioning that, that the decision in the separate ad tech trial, the one that was promised in late December or early January, is still MIA. And it's really reached the point where I'm kind of hoping 60 Minutes looks into it, or maybe the BBC, because it really doesn't make any sense. You have a judge who, by all accounts, beat every deadline by a mile in terms of running the trial, said, yeah, give me a few weeks and I'll have a decision for you. And that was, in early to mid, December.
It was.
And now we're heading into mid-March. And it's now not just a little late, it's several months late. And so at some point, somebody needs to start asking, why is that? Now, in my brain, I'm thinking, well, maybe there's some side deal being negotiated amongst Google and others. Everybody I know that understands how the trial system works a little bit better than me is saying, no, Alan, you're absolutely out of your mind. But if it's not that, then what in the world is it? Because it's already had an impact on the separate state AG trial, which we haven't really talked about. It's supposed to start in a week or two, and is now starting, I think, mid-August. And one of the reasons it's starting in mid-August is because they felt like the decision in the DOJ case for Google with AdTech was going to have a bearing on this other case. And so we have a Where's Waldo moment here.
Where's Waldo? Well, her name's Leona Brinkema, the judge. And the one thing I am confident about Judge Brinkema is that if there is a hold-up, there's a reason for it. She's not one that's easily intimidated. So for the listeners that don't know about Judge Brinkema, she was the judge that she tried the only September 11 terrorist ever to be tried. She ran that trial, and during that trial, evidence came out that the CIA was running black sites around the world where they were taking people without trial and torturing them. And it was mentioned in trial, and then it was all hushed up. But she stepped up and said, no, I'm going to find out what happened here. You can only imagine that went down not particularly well at the White House. And she did, and she fearlessly tracked it down and tracked it down and tracked it down. And the CIA was eventually forced to shut down a series of these black sites. I don't think she's scared of Sundar Pichai. I think that's kind of the first thing to recognize. So I don't think this is a fear and intimidation thing. But what I might say is that we've got the way the Department of Justice, both the previous one and this one, have prosecuted these trials, I think has been very strategic and very, very smart. I know you and I both are quite big fans of the way they did this. They went after the App Store first. That was the lowest hanging fruit. It was only $40 billion, just $40 billion. And then they really quickly did that in front of a jury, and they won that case. So they had a notch on the board. It was like, we've won one. And that kind of put some wind in everybody's sails. Then they took on the big one, the decider search. Are we going to be able to prove that Google is a search monopoly? Now, the evidence was overwhelming that it was. But to your point, for 50 years, even though you are a blatant monopoly, that hasn't always meant that you were found to be one in a court case for lots of reasons. But they won that case as well. So suddenly you had the easy one. I'm not going to say it's easy, but the easier one. Then you had the big one, kind of the decider. We have now proven that big companies like this can be held accountable in antitrust. And then we're going to go after the money, which is the one that Google will fight to defend the hardest. But with 2 losses already behind them, they're already on the back foot at the start of the third one. So I wonder if what's happening here is that the DOJ's breakup request was so comprehensive after the antitrust trial that if you wait for those to be validated by the White House, yes, we are going to push on and we're going to keep going, okay, then it probably becomes easier for Judge Brinkema to come out with a ruling that says yes, and I'm going to come in behind this breakup. So I wonder if she's not on speed dial, right? I just wonder if she was just waiting to see what the White House's position was on this, because she might have had to have come to a slightly different recommendation afterwards if the White House had tried to pull back. So I think that now that she's got that, I suspect that we get a decision from her fairly soon. That's my prediction.
That sounds as plausible as any, and I get the logic, and I would just agree wholeheartedly. Judge Brinkema, boy, the ad tech world is complicated, convoluted, intentionally opaque, and a little bit of an insider boys club. And she was able to cut through that, flawlessly in a very quick time to get herself up to speed. So, mad props to Judge Brinkema. And I think that what you're suggesting sounds like that could be it. Although we'll see in about a week or two, because if we don't get the decision by, say, April 1st or 2nd, then maybe you and I have to put our heads together and find a new theory.
I told you, it's cat squared, right? We'll take this and we'll open a law business as well. So let's talk about the state AGs, because this is also a really important case, and I actually know some people that are involved in this case that have been deposed in this case. Talk a little bit about that.
So, well, I know enough to know that it's a separate case. I have not focused on it a ton, in part because it's kind of way off in the future. The big lightning rod there is the Jedi Blue component and the partnership between Meta and Google, where they effectively carved up the ad serving space in such a way that preferenced each other, and that's, I think, going to be I don't want to say that's the big tell that'll come out of this trial, because I think a lot of that has already been released in some of the pre-trial affidavits. But to me, that's sort of the big component here.
I'd like to imagine that in all of the offices of all of the 5 big tech companies, there's a big bound leather book, like one of those old leather books that you used to have in those wizard stories that you'd see in the movies. And this is their playbook. Okay, and in here are like 15 pages of mad spells that they all work with each other on that can convince and persuade the entire public to fall in behind them. And so we already know that Google's playbook involves, okay, I'm going to give $26 billion to Google, to Apple, to control all of the searches that take place on Apple devices, and we'll keep that out of sight. I think that's chapter 3. Okay, but then Jedi Blue is like probably chapter 7, and so I'll explain it, and then feel free to add anything on top of this, Alan, if you think I've missed anything. But the deal was basically that when Google bought DoubleClick, the ad company, and began to run programmatic advertising, this gave Google a kind of a turbocharge into taking full monopoly of advertising. Really, it automated advertising and just made it press a button and click, all of the ads get served, and click, all the data comes back, and everything's automated. But then Meta didn't want Google to have that run completely on its own. So it started to look at building its own programmatic platform. And so you suddenly saw these two potentially coming into competition. So there was a deal done in the back rooms, and it was called Jedi Blue. And the logic was that Meta would stay out of programmatic and not compete if Google and Meta did a deal together whereby Google would give preferential ad deals and supply and various other things to Meta and to Meta's advertising clients. And so effectively, out of sight, enabled the two of them to collaborate together in much the same way as Google did with Apple. And the last thing I want to add before you jump in is the name. So what I love about this is that the reason it was called Jedi Blue, the blue bit relates to Meta because of the Meta logo, but the Jedi bit, internally within Google, there are emails in the evidence that Google called this project Jedi because there's no way in the world that any normal person would ever think that this was a good idea. So the only way it could work is if they were able to enact a Jedi mind trick to get them to say, these are not the droids you're looking for. And they managed to pull it off. So anything with Jedi on it, I hope there's a few more hidden there in the evidence, but that just shows just how determined and how confident they were that they could just turn the world to their belief system.
Well, yeah. So the one thing I will say is that Google has done an amazing job at convincing the rest of the ad tech community, including most publishers, that whatever they say should be accepted on face value. And we continue to see examples where nobody is standing up and saying, wait, hold on. This doesn't make sense. I need you to explain it to me again. And occasionally that happens, and then suddenly the big Ted Lasso smile from the Google rep turns into something a little bit angrier. But there's very little pushback on the narrative being spun by Google over the years. Now, part of that is that half of the ad tech industry just wants to and hopes to work at Google at some point. And so the last thing you want to do is to tick off your potential employer. But I also think there's a fundamental lack of sophistication on these types of issues within the larger ad tech space. And I know that sounds like a really bold thing to say about the industry that I've been in for about 25 years. But I do think it's true. And one of the things that I've been focusing on, particularly over the last 6 months, is pointing out those examples in the hope that people start to see the canard for what it is.
Let me end with this. So this is a very sad story, but I'll tell you exactly how it went down. And I think that the important job of people like you and I that have got some skin and some history and some scar tissue in this, we should tell people exactly what it means in real life. So I was an executive at one of the most storied newspapers in Australia, the Sydney Morning Herald. It's the kind of New York Times. It's the grand dame of publishing here in Australia. Amazing history. And so one day the head of sales comes to see me, takes me into one of those third floor conference rooms with the plastic plants, and he sits me down and he goes, I've got the best news ever. And I was like, what's that? He said, well, we've got this new technology that enables us to automate all of our advertising. It's called programmatic, and the way it's going to work is that we just basically open a pipe, and down the pipe come all the ads. They've already been retargeted. We already know exactly where they're going. We've given them all our data, and now they're going to do all the work for us. And all these ads are going to drop into place, and then it's going to cost us almost nothing. And then we're going to get all the data back, and we're going to become more and more efficient. And basically, our entire advertising business is now just going to explode. And then he turned around, and through the glass wall, there was the entire sales team of the paper. And he said, we just don't need any of them anymore. They can all go. This is going to cost us now. These are his staff. We don't need any of these people. Okay, all this is going to be automated. Our margin's going to be terrific. We're great. There's a bit more detail than that, but that's kind of the bullet point version. And I said to him, where's this incredible magic money making machine come from? Like, how does it work? And he goes, oh, it's Google's. And then I'm quiet for a minute, and I said, look, pretty much my lived experience with Google is that every time something new comes out of Google, Google wins, not us. What makes you think that it's going to be different this time? And he paused for a moment. He said, Ricky, right now, any dollar's a good dollar. So here's what then happened. Okay, the real world experience. What happened was the dollars we used to make became less and less dollars. Our ability to control our data and our ownership of our audience and the relationship we had with our audience diminished and diminished and diminished. The ad quality on the pages just got worse and worse and worse. I don't know what the algorithm was in the background, but it wasn't a good outcome. The sales team started to be fired more and more and more and more often. And then ultimately what happened was the building, first of all, the entire sales team was laid off. All ad sales were outsourced entirely to Google, which led to the entire sales team going. Google then moved into our office. They then took over one floor. Then they took over all the floors, and we had to leave the building. Okay. And then about 18 months later, that grand newspaper company was sold for pennies on the dollar to a rival. And so that's the real world experience. Lots of people lost their jobs. Millions of people lost access to a news brand that they loved. Why? Because we decided to automate advertising, give it all to Google. CPM and sell-through collapsed, and Google grew 14% last year to 350 billion.
Yeah.
So I think it probably is time to just say, hey, let's not let any more cats die. Let's fix this and set our sights on building better for the future.
Agreed. Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. Down to Delaware we go. Alan, thanks so much again. Look, I'm really enjoying these conversations because it enables us to dive deeply into what's actually happening within the media companies and what's actually happening in ad tech. And we have to continue to be brave enough to call BS on the stuff when it is. So let's keep doing that.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to it, Ricky.
Thanks for tuning in. The Future Media Podcast is a production of Future Media and Ricky Sutton.